Hi, I'm Rigger. This is You're Right, and today let's do some math. Woo! The most exciting of subjects. But today's math is important math because people have been asking questions. The question I see people asking the most is wondering, is Raven a maiden yet in the flashback with Summer? And we can assemble some pieces from around RWBY to try and answer that question as best we can. Before we start though, I'd like to say that the main reason people want to know that is the seeming suspicion that they went to the vault to ask that missing question Jin has. And I just don't know about that one, guys. Some say that they went to Spring to use her and take her to the question, the Spring before Raven, or just Raven herself is already Spring here and can do it herself. Either way, I'm still not sure about it. And by not sure, I mean seriously doubtful. Just look at Raven's behavior. It certainly suggests she has no idea how the vaults actually work. Her question to Cinder might have been misdirection and an act, sure, but she genuinely has no idea what to expect when opening it, and is startled when it starts to work, and she's not being observed by anyone. There's no one to keep the act up for. She's never seen this vault open before. So, the only way that works then is that Raven and Summer went to whoever Spring was before. But that means they took them to Leo, convinced Leo to open the vault, which they'd had to have done, because there's no other way into the vault, because this entrance/exit didn't exist yet, and even if it did, Raven didn't know about it because she would have just used it in the past to get the lamp herself in secret without any of the fighting, so that wasn't a thing. So the only way this works is they went to Leo, and then somehow after convincing Leo to open the vault for them, Raven did not go with them, but let her prized possession of the Spring Maiden go with Summer alone, and open the vault and ask a question. I can't believe for a second that Raven would allow that, especially afterwards, still apparently not asking any questions about how anything worked or finding out anything at all. I just can't make that work in my head. It just doesn't add up logically no matter which way you cut it. Not to mention, on top of that, they then have to know Jin's password, which seems very unlikely that Oz would have given that to anyone. So why would Summer know it, why would Spring know it, or why would Raven know it at all? Why would he have any intention of letting them use it? And if he had told them the password, it means he would think that they would use it, but he would never leave it up to them. He would never leave it up to anyone. The whole point is keeping it a secret for himself so no one can use it. The only way that works is that Oz sanctioned them to ask a question. But there'd be no reason to do that because Oz was pretty sure he already had the answer that you can't destroy Salem, and that's what we assume she's going to do. Also, on top of all that, Leo at least says that he hasn't seen Spring since she ran away over a decade ago. And while you might say he's lying to the good guys, we are pretty sure he wouldn't lie to the bad guys to save his own skin, but he tells them the same thing, and he has no idea about Spring being with Raven. That came as a legitimate surprise that he then immediately passed on. And it means that even after hearing Ruby Rose's name, Leo also left out that Summer Rose was around for this whole thing too. And she does introduce herself to him, and they look exactly the same. So literally the only way it adds up is that Oz actually did know about this, so he's lying again, which maybe, that he gave the password to Summer and or Raven or Spring, which is very unlikely, and he let them go and ask a question without his supervision, which is very unlikely, and they managed to tell Leo this, who believed them, and then he opened the vault, and Raven did not go with them for some reason down to the vault to learn any of this. I can't square that working out in my head in any way. I'm sorry to say that I think that the missing question is just something Oz asked in the past. And while you might say that's bad writing or whatever to leave a thread like that, I think it's literally just a narrative tool to not give Team RWBY so much power. They wanted the 3 wishes theme with the genie, but 3 would have been too powerful to give them because the audience would constantly ask, why didn't they ask this question? Why didn't they ask this question? Which is something they did already. Instead, when they were planning out Volume 6, they already knew RWBY would be asking 1 question, and then rather than being left with 2 questions, they're left with just 1, meaning they can't use a frivolous question to learn things they shouldn't know yet. So it's just a writing tool to not give them as much power. There's just more tension and more peril that way. But past that, let's do the math and work out if Raven is actually the Maiden here or not. Now, none of this is perfectly solid, and the timelines in RWBY are kept purposely vague, but we can do our best to guesstimate with the few numbers that we have. So starting out, we have Raven enrolling in Beacon at 17. That's the general enrollment age, and there's nothing to suggest anything else happened. And Raven actually says to Yang, when we came of age, we enrolled in Beacon. So that all adds up. She was 17. We also know Team Stark graduated. Crow says as much in his talk with Yang. They're the coolest team to ever graduate Beacon. We know a Beacon enrollment is 4 years, so this makes the entire team 21 at the time of their graduation. The next part is some assuming, but let's be reasonable. It seems doubtful Raven fell pregnant while at school and graduated her final year whilst in the middle of a pregnancy. Let's at least let them have left school before that happened. However, if you want to make this as tight as possible in timeline-wise and give them the best chance, as early as possible, we'll say it's another 9 months post-graduation. So graduation night, they had a fling, and 9 months later, Yang is born. But to make this round numbers so it's easier, let's bump that 9 months to 1 year, so we just add 1 more year, so we're playing with whole numbers. And, maybe it's 3 months after graduation, you get my point. So Yang would be born when Raven is 22. Remember, this is as early as possible. It still seems too early, but it's as early as possible. Because there is evidence against this, like, when did Crow and Raven get their bird powers? Even for Ozpin, it would feel very strange for him to give them that level of power, when Salem wasn't attacking or anything, before they actually graduated to being full huntsmen. It feels like more they would graduate and start working for him, and after a while he would then give them the bird powers when he decided they would become part of his, inner sanctum. And you'd think that service time to Oz would have to be spent well doing missions for him and proving your worth, probably not taking off over half a year with a pregnancy, because you're not going into combat like that. I mean, maybe Raven would for a while, but eventually you can't, so it just doesn't seem to add up. But either way, we'll go with the best numbers possible for this. So we're still at 22. At the start of the series, Yang is 17 years old. So that would mean that Raven, and subsequently the rest of Team Stark, is 39 years old when the series starts. And I can buy that math, they're all just about to hit 40, that seems about right, just before 40 or early 40s works. But the 39 number will make more sense because Lionheart says that Spring ran away over a decade ago. It's not exactly clear how much time has passed between Volume 1 and this moment in Volume 5, but it's probably less than a year, but several months. If we take the phrase over a decade to mean, let's say, closer to 10 years than 15, because 15 feels like the next landmark thing to say, by which I mean, it would be weird to say it happened over a decade ago if it was 17 years. You'd probably say over 15 years ago. And if it happened 15 years ago, you'd probably say that. So over 10 is probably closer to 10 than 15. So let's say it's 11. So Spring went away 11 years ago. And that would make some sense, because that means in this best case scenario, with all the numbers at their minimums and maximums, the tightest schedule Raven can get her Maiden powers is 28 to 29 years old, 27 if you're more generous with Leo's number, and 29 if you give Raven some extra time working for Oz before pregnancy. So in the 27 to 29 range. And that makes a lot of sense if you take Glinda's words of Maiden powers only going to young women, and interpret the cutoff point to be about 30. At 30 you'll move out of being a young woman into just being a woman, into middle age kind of thing. So that sounds about fair, in a magical interpretation of that word, not necessarily a cultural interpretation of that word. I will say, this isn't counting how long Spring was with Raven too, that is also a weird amount of time, because Raven says she gave Spring training. No matter how much I trained her, no matter how much I put her through, she never learned. That would imply a fair bit of time. I would think it would be at least a year or more, but I'm going to be generous and say it was 6 months, so we don't have to cross into another year. But realistically, that doesn't feel like enough time for Raven to decide to completely give up on her and mercy kill her, apparently. So, if you did count that time, it'd definitely push her age closer to the 30 mark, if not crossing into early 30s. But that almost feels like we're pushing the boundary of the young woman stipulation for the powers, so around 30 sounds fair. So now we know the approximate range that Raven got her powers. So when did this flashback take place? Well, let's look at Yang and RWBY. So we know that Yang and RWBY are 2 years apart, so there's at least a 2-year gap there. Yang once said that when Summer left, RWBY couldn't even talk yet. Although, if I'm honest, the RWBY we're shown here in this flashback looks too old, even if it's little kid with big head. This isn't a baby or anything here. But even more than that, I feel like saying Yang is 5 and RWBY is 3 might even be too generous. But let's just take that as a minimum. Yang is 5, RWBY is 3 here. That seems fair, to try and sort of split the middle ground. That would mean, at the time of this encounter on our timeline, it'd be 5 years after Yang's birth at 22. So Raven here is 27. Which means the annoying answer to the question of is she a maiden yet is a very irritating maybe. Honestly, pushing these numbers up and down, shuffling things around, it could be either or. She's right on the edge. If Yang is 6 and RWBY is 4, then Raven would be 28, and that's probably more probable into the end of her 20s, which seems like when she would get the powers most likely. The frustrating answer is it's so close on that line, literally how many years you give Raven getting pregnant after graduation, or how long she trained Spring. All these things really change how you interpret it. How you interpret over a decade also, and how old you think the girls are here, especially given what's been said in the past. The annoying answer is, I don't know, it's very, very close. Like I said, that's not even factoring in how long everything else happened, how long Raven lived with Spring, which would push the age up that she got her powers even higher, which starts pushing Raven over 30 and actually less likely that she has them in this scene, depending on what ages you think Yang and RWBY are. Again, it's very sort of complicated. Everything is teetering right on the edge with the gap of like 2 or 3 years-ish. Basically, she could be a maiden already. She might be like a year or 2 away though. It could happen on this very mission too, that's possible. It's all too close to call. Now, I know how this looks. You could easily look at this and say, well, what if Leo actually meant over a decade was 12 or 13 years? Suddenly, you've pushed back when Raven got her powers past the flashback, so she's already the maiden in this scene. That's an easy fix. And while that's true, you can just as easily say that it took longer for Raven to get pregnant and have Yang, that Raven should have been working for Oz longer, that the Spring Maiden should have lived with Raven for longer, and all of those things not only push up when she got her powers, it starts pushing up her age overall, which pushes all of Team Stark into their 40s, which is fine, but also that then pushes the age that she got her powers probably over 30, and it pushes the incidence of the flashback and her getting her maiden powers further and further apart. Both of these things are possible. It's so close, that's what makes it so hard. But if you want another comparison point, there is one other thing we can look at, and that's Vinal. Now, how old do you think Vinal is? It's hard to say because she has a rough upbringing, so obviously that matures a person. Because despite the fact Vinal is a decoy, she's not Spring, but she's meant to be a convincing decoy, so that even people from the school, people who knew anything about Spring, maybe even people who knew Spring, would buy that this is Spring. Meaning that the decoy that Raven brought in is supposed to be believable as Spring, and she would make sure she had to pick a girl who was very close to what Spring would have looked like years later. So, the skin color has to match, the eye color you could possibly change, the hair color you can change, but age is a big thing. She should be an equivalent age to what Spring would be at this point. She should fit the age description. They say Spring was young when she inherited her powers and enthusiastic, but then got scared and ran away. Answering how old Vinal is might let you know how long more than a decade is for Leo. But unfortunately, that is so hard to say too. Every answer kind of gets more disturbing, honestly. If you took over a decade to mean 11, and Spring was underage for enrollment, let's say she's like 15, that would make Vinal 26-ish? Maybe that's right, but it doesn't seem like that. It seems like she's probably not that old, especially the way she still takes commands from Raven. I know that she's her leader and like a mother figure and like a mentor, but she also doesn't seem totally mature enough to be 26 probably living this lifestyle. So let's scale it back a bit more. So does that mean that Spring inherited her powers at like 12, making Vinal 23? That's probably closer. But does that mean Raven took in and killed a girl who was like 13 or 14 years old to get those powers before she turned 30? Because that's a big yikes. Which doesn't mean she didn't do that, it just means that she was killing a very young girl to do it, and it's just even worse of an act. So we reach the point where I say, if you want my opinion on Raven, because that's all the math, there is no more math to be done. All I have is an opinion now. I don't think she's the maiden here. I think this mission goes wrong, and what she sees scares the hell out of Raven, seeing what she's up against, seeing who Salem really is. We know that Raven and Crow were spies for Ozpin. One of the things he mentions when he talks to Team RWBY about what their role was, one of the things was keeping track of new maidens and following the maidens around to make sure they're safe. And if the power changed hands, tracking them down. I think Summer's defeat scared Raven, seeing how outclassed they were, and she used her knowledge that she'd been using to track Maidens for Oz to find the girl, perhaps even gaslight her while she was at school with fear until she ran away, and then after scaring the girl out of the school, offered her protection. I can protect you, come with my group. Literally took her under her wing, and she did that in order to have a weapon on hand should Salem come calling, because that was always Raven's plan, that she had to have a contingency for when Salem came calling. We saw that in Volume 5. Then, the girl isn't up to scratch, so she took the powers herself. A heinous act, but completely driven out of fear, because she'd seen what happened firsthand. Which if she did in the year or so after this flashback, it more likely puts her in that 28 to 29 range, which seems to fit more with how it sounds like she got her powers, so that all adds up. The other option that came to mind, and this is an outside pick and people might not want to hear this one, is that Summer was not the Summer Maiden, but was a maiden. I know, right? That's impossible. That's blasphemous. How could they have her be a maiden and not the Summer Maiden? It's right there in the name, and winter is the winter. You just humor me for a second. Imagine Summer was not the Summer Maiden, but is actually the Spring Maiden in this flashback. Pretty crazy. But if that happened, there's a chance that Summer thought she could win, because, like a lot of comments I see, she would be the fabled, all-powerful, silver-eyed and maiden, and she fails. That doesn't work. And also, an added thing, if you're one of those people who really thinks they're on their way to ask a question to Jin, and you feel like that question has to be answered, if Summer was the Spring Maiden, it answers the question, where Summer would have Raven take her to Haven, and once at Haven, being the Maiden, she would convince Leo to open the vault, and let's say, perhaps, for whatever reason, they insisted that Raven not come down to the vault, whether it be she keeps guard, or she's not allowed to see what happens, because this is all under Order of Oz, even if it's not, it's a lie from Summer. That would actually keep everything working together. The only thing missing is how Summer got the password for Jin. So if you say that being the Maiden, for whatever reason, that Oz told her the password, or she figured it out, or she just thought she'd figured it out because she knew the genie's name and had pieced together the pieces because she'd heard Oz talk about it, whatever the case may be, you could have it where Summer and Raven go to Haven, Summer convinces Leo that Oz totally sent them to let them into the vault. Raven is not allowed to go with them. Summer opens the vault, asks Jin a question, possibly about what she's going to do, and then they leave, and that's how Raven knows where the vault is and how to get in, not that she can do it herself, and that leads into the planet Haven. And then, if they go directly from there to the Salem fight, it's possible that there wasn't enough time for Raven to quiz Summer about any of the things she did. And Summer is of more of a stern personality, whether she might not pass on that information as willingly if she didn't want to. So all of that actually adds up more than any of the other theories I've seen about them getting into the vault to me. But upon death, she doesn't want to give her powers to RWBY or Yang, so she clears her mind of them. And Raven is right there, so that'd be disastrous just going straight to her, because Salem would just kill her too. Or Raven has already run away at this point, so she's putting Raven out of her mind either way. So, at the last moment in desperation before death, Summer clears her mind on purpose. Not thinking of her daughter, not thinking of Yang, not thinking of Raven, purposely clearing her mind. Which sounds sort of dumb and random, but it actually brings up one of the key points of the powers, was that if you do that, they go to someone random, and so far that hasn't happened in the story. So, we bring in that random element. So, they randomly go to this little girl in Mistral. But what happens next? Summer doesn't come back, Raven has run off. And then, Raven, in her duties, hears about the new Maiden. At this point, she's been betrayed by Oz because she didn't know all the truths about Salem, and her frenemy / longtime teammate is dead, and she feels guilty about that. So, as a culmination of all these things, she seeks out Spring. Initially because she feels shame, because she is the reason, or they were the reason, that this burden has now fallen on to this young girl. And feeling some of that responsibility, she takes her under her wing. But, unfortunately, she's not cut out for this lifestyle, and Raven is forced to make the tough choice knowing what's coming, and that she would never survive against Salem, this little girl, because Summer couldn't do it, and neither could she. The best option is that she just mercy kills her and takes the powers herself. It's horrible, but it's, mercy. And while it's a long shot, there is another little point. It means that the powers themselves are actually a reminder of her failure. not just with spring, but with summer, especially if, like we saw with the Penny Winter thing and like they've talked about before, a little bit of the soul really does stick around in the powers, like all those people that have touched it sort of leave a mark on it, which would mean that a stain of Summer's soul and Spring's soul would be left permanently attached to Raven to carry around all the time, to remind her of her depressing, crushing cowardice, shame, and failures. Anyway, that's just shooting the breeze, but I thought it was a cool idea that I don't see anyone bring up, mostly because if Summer is a maiden, she has to be the Summer Maiden, right? But just to throw a curveball in there, thought I'd throw it out there. The truth at the end of the day is, I can't answer the question definitively, but I gave it my best shot. I don't think she's the Maiden, I think she's just shy by a few years, but however you adjust those times, you could push it into that range, but you can't push it too far because then you're pushing Raven too far over 30, and I think she'd be out of the range for young woman who gets the powers, which seems to be a rule. So I think she's just shy, but this show can easily push around those years or just leave it vague and say she is. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. And until next time, my name is Rigger, hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope I did alright.